What's happening? Good to have you all here for our next lecture on the brain. The last lecture was about the brain structure. So hopefully you drew and labeled the different regions and lobes and structures in the brain. They're going to talk about how psychologists do research on the brain. Okay? So really only two big topics for today. Does that mean this will be a short video? Who's to say? We're going to talk about brain imaging, so the different scans we can do on the brain. Then we're going to talk about this weird kind of study called a split brain study, split brain research. So in our last class, we talked about how we have the four different lobes, right? FPOT, frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And we have some other structures, right? The cerebellum, that makes you the bell of the ball, dealing with muscle movement, muscle memory. We have the brain stem that is working to keep you alive with your heart rate, your breathing. Up top, you have the motor cortex and the sensory cortex and the visual cortex and the prefrontal cortex and Wernicke's area and Broca's area. How do we know all this information about the brain, right? Like you can't just open up the brain and look inside like I can with my handy little brain here, right? Like this is nice. Just open up the brain and look inside, right? Can't do that. How do we know all this information? Well, it's by doing brain imaging, okay? So there are 6 questions that researchers ask about the brain. You don't need to write anything down this slide. Just kind of be thinking to yourself, which of these questions interests you the most? Is the brain working? Pretty basic question, like, is this person's brain on? Think about someone who's been in an accident or someone who's had brain damage. Like, is their brain even working? Number 2, what does the brain look like? Number 3, what do specific parts of the brain do? Number 4, how do different parts of the brain respond differently during different activities? Number 5, how can we make the brain better? And number 6, what makes the brain worse? Think to yourself, which of these 6 questions interests you the most about the brain? For me, it's number 4, okay? I think this is really fascinating, how when I'm singing versus walking versus thinking versus laughing versus crying versus watching a movie versus reading a book, how are different parts of the brain active at different times? That's kind of my most interesting question, but I'm curious to know what it is for you. Okay, so let's go through each question. Now you may want to write. So we're still on Roman numeral 1. It's all about brain imaging. We're going to go through the 6 different types of imaging techniques, the types of scans, the types of research we can do on the brain. So number 1, brain activity. Is the brain working? The test we would do is called an EEG. It stands for electroencephalogram, okay? And that electro means that what we are measuring here is electricity. Every time a neuron fires in your brain, it releases an electrical spark. What's that called? An action potential. Very good, you. So these brain waves are just signs that neurons are firing, okay? So the beta waves are when your brain is super alert. We're going to talk about this more when we talk about sleep later in this unit. Alpha waves are when you're awake but relaxed. Theta waves are when you're falling asleep. And then delta waves are when you're in deep sleep. So BAT-D are the order of brain waves from most alert to least alert. And the way we know what stage your brain is in, it's by giving you an EEG. You might have seen movies, television shows where someone puts on a little hat like this with all these wires connected, and we get a readout of exactly what their brain is doing. Second question we can ask, what's the brain look like? Okay, we know it's on, we know it's working, it's active, neurons are firing. What's your brain look like versus what my brain looks like, okay? So the first test you can do to see what the brain looks like is called a CT scan, or sometimes it's called a CAT scan, computed axial topography. Axial, there's an X in that, okay? These are X-rays. The way that I remember this, Mr. Jones does not like cats. I think we should just go ahead and X-ray all the cats. I'm not a big fan of cats, so let's X-ray them, let's zap them. Is this good for you? Is this something you want to do to your brain a lot? Is it something you want to do to your pet cat? Probably not, right? But CAT scans let us have a picture of the brain structure using X-rays. Now you can also, something a little bit less dangerous but more expensive, is an MRI, and the M stands for magnetic. This is when we use giant magnets. What those magnets do is they get your nuclei, which are always spinning in your cells, right? The nucleus and the soma. They use magnets to sort of alter the way that your cells are spinning. And then this giant machine, you've seen them before maybe in movies or TV shows, you like lie in this giant tube as the magnets whir around you really fast. The computer can read how those cells are spinning and use the reading and the spinning to determine which tissues, which densities are where in the brain. And you can get a pretty detailed picture. If you look, MRI gives you a little bit of a better picture than the CAT scan. More expensive, takes longer, requires fancier equipment. Or the CAT scan, not as detailed and a little more dangerous. We don't want to always use x-rays on our brain, but can be a quick way to get a picture to see if something is obviously wrong with the structure of the brain, like a tumor, for example, or some brain tissue damage. Okay. Third question we might want to ask is, what do specific parts of the brain do? Okay. You know, if this part got damaged, if this part got damaged, if this part got damaged, what would that do? How would that impact you? So the way that we can do that, one, I'm going to show you this video. I'll probably show it to you when we're in class together because it's hard to do with the projector. Where you can pull it up on your own if you want. But they can actually use electricity to like zap a very specific part of your brain, not damaging it, not like a lightning strike. Think more like a electrical massage on a particular part of your brain. And that lets them know, okay, well, we send electrical signals to this part of the brain. How's the person act different? What does the person do? What can the person not do? So electrical stimulation of the brain allows them to figure out what a specific part does. In some cases, there are also what's called lesions. These can happen naturally, like there can be some sort of an accident where your brain gets lesioned. The brain over here on the right is the brain of a former NFL player. You see those black splotches? Those are lesions, meaning that is damage to the brain. The brain has been physically altered. And like, if this person, if we know that later on in their life, they lost, for example, their language abilities. Well, that might let us know like, okay, language is probably in one of these areas. If they lost the ability to use their right hand, we might know, okay, well, this black splotch here, all the people we've seen with black splotches in their brain here, while they were alive, they lost the power to move and control their left hand. That would let us know that we can kind of figure out what specific parts of the brain do. And that's sort of like a natural way. Sometimes this just like happens. If you watch the crash course video about the brain, you'll learn about Phineas Gage. We should watch that video too. See this iron rod? It went through his skull, through his eye, out the roof of his skull, and he lived through it. He just literally had a hole in his head, sort of like a naturally occurring lesion. And then they were able to see, okay, well, what was different about Phineas Gage after these parts of his brain were damaged? So in rare cases, sometimes they might artificially lesion someone's brain. If someone is having serious disorders or issues, we might actually purposefully damage their brain to try and help them out with their physical symptoms. And we'll talk about that with the split brain research. That's from artificially performing a surgery to operate on someone's brain. So this is how we can tell what parts of the brain do. Number 4, this is the question I said I was most interested in, the function of brain areas. How do different parts of the brain respond in different areas? So what they'll do for these tests, the first one is called an fMRI. The F stands for functional, and this is still using magnets like an MRI. They'll take a ton of MRIs, one after the other, one after the other, and what they'll look to see is how did blood flow differently while you were doing some sort of a task, okay? So in this chart here on the right, if this person was singing, okay, the red areas let us know that these parts of the brain were using up the most energy and were most active while singing. So then we can tell that these parts of the brain are these singing parts of the brain, okay? So you can do an fMRI. Here's another way of looking at it. So this is someone, okay? The red means they're using this a lot, and this was a test of your vision, looking at a complicated scene. So are these 6 brains, are they facing up or are they facing down? Where's the red spot, the occipital lobe, okay? All these heads are facing up, right? This red area, the VC, the visual cortex, that's in the back of your brain where the occipital lobe is, right? You have eyes in the back of your head, I told you. Okay? What you have here is when this person's eyes are closed, no specific activity. When these people's eyes are open, you start to see more red activity, meaning more blood flowing to the visual cortex, because that part of the brain is using more energy. It's hard at work. And then when they're looking at something complicated, wow, look at how that occipital lobe lights up. I think these tests are so cool. So this is an fMRI. Here's another example. Someone who's experiencing happiness versus not experiencing happiness. We can tell which parts of the brain are more active when you experience happiness, pleasure, and addiction as well, which we'll be talking about with drugs in a little bit. So you have the fMRI, and then there's a similar test called a PET, a PET scan. What they do here, instead of looking at blood flow, and we put a star by these points because they love to ask about it, people get them confused. Instead what they do is they take these chemicals, glucose, which is like sugar, food, right? And they tag it with radioactive isotopes so they can track where these little chemicals are going, okay? It doesn't harm the person, a ton at least. And they want to see not where the blood's flowing, but which part of the brains are using up the most glucose, the most sugar, the most energy. And that lets us know, like, these parts of the brain are most active during a particular task, okay? The way I remember this is, if you want to keep your pet alive, right, it's a PET, a PET scan, well, you want to give your pet food, glucose, right? This energy for them to live, right? So PET scan is about glucose. So here's some PET scans. Same setup where the red shows us which parts of this person's brain are active. So while they're walking, you see the motor cortex lit up. While they're seeing, you see the visual cortex. While hearing, temporal lobe, auditory cortex. While thinking, we have the frontal lobe, maybe that prefrontal cortex in charge of planning and organizing. When remembering, well, this is probably that hippocampus. Remember, you would know if you saw a hippo on campus, you would remember that. So this is PET scan. Here's another way of looking at it, another representation here. When they're looking at words, we have the occipital lobe and the visual cortex lit up, right? This person's obviously facing to the left, we have the cerebellum and the brainstem down here, right? Frontal lobe, occipital lobe. When they're listening to words, though, hearing words, we have activity in the temporal lobe, right? Wernicke's area, right? Close to the ears. Number 5, what can we do for the brain if something's wrong with it? How can we improve it? Well, some people believe that you can use electricity to stimulate the brain and to help neurons form more connections, right? Your thinking, your brain activity is neurons firing, releasing neurotransmitters, and getting more neurons to fire. Well, some folks believe that by using electricity or by using transcranial magnetic stimulation, right? When we're talking about the brain, we talk a lot about electricity and magnetic waves. They believe that we can stimulate parts of the brain. We're going to watch a video later this year where this guy has what he calls a thinking hat. It's a hat that gently sends electrical signals into the brain because he believes it helps you learn, it helps you remember things because it allows those neurons to fire more, release the neurotransmitters, and form strong synaptic bonds, right, the synapse, with other neurons, and that helps people process faster. He's hoping it'll save people from Alzheimer's and dementia if we can really improve the brain. So this is kind of controversial new research. Number 6, what hurts the brain? We might watch this, or I'll post the link. If you've seen the movie Concussion, we might have a little extra credit opportunity for you. That's based on the true story of a man trying to do research on NFL players and what happens to their brain after repeated blunt impact traumas. And what you have here are actual, you can't tell from like, it looks like maybe a cartoon drawing. These are actual brains cut in half. This is someone who passed away from natural causes, okay? Normal brain. This is someone of the same age who was an NFL player and had advanced CTE, meaning repeated impact of the brain, right? That's what concussions are. Repeated impact of the brain physically damages the brain and hurts those neurons, and all those sensitive, fragile structures we've been talking about, those all get impacted. And TBI, traumatic brain injury, is when the brain has been changed as a result of this, okay? Some checks for understanding. I would encourage you to pause this and try to answer these 4 questions and identify what scan might a doctor do, or what type of imaging test or research needs to be done to help these 4 individuals? So pause it, make sure you can answer these. A question like this could be on your next quiz. All right, hopefully you did that. Moving on to the second part of our lecture here on split brain research. Okay, split brain. Well, what do we know about the brain? The brain, they say it is plastic. That word plastic means changeable, moldable. When you think about plastic, as in plastic toys or plastic containers or plastic chairs, right? Plastic, that word actually means for something to be changed, right? The reason we can use plastic, that substance, for so many different objects is because it's easily changeable and moldable. Your brain also has the ability to change itself, okay? Especially when you're younger. We might watch this video clip. I'll post the links. But Girl with Half a Brain, about a young girl who actually had a hemispherectomy, meaning a removal of a hemisphere of her brain, and she ended up okay. Seems like a pretty normal person, right? One of you could have a big chunk of your brain missing and not even know it, and we might not know it because the brain can actually almost heal itself and fix itself, okay? The brain can adapt. That's the idea of neuroplasticity. So circle that word, put a star by that word, neuroplastic. Neuroplastic. The brain is moldable. And what this means, because the brain is moldable, they can actually do some interesting things with the brain. So these 2 guys, Sperry and Gazzaniga and Sperry, they did split brain research. Sperry, split brain. Mr. Jones, what do you mean by split brain research? Well, what they would do with patients, if they had patients that were having seizures, too much electrical activity in the brain, what they would do is they would cut down the middle of their brain, like slice right down the middle, okay? That part of the brain, the tissue between the hemispheres, is called the corpus callosum. Awesome, corpus callosum, okay? Here's an image of the corpus callosum, okay? So like, it's this little tissue here that normally connects the right and left hemispheres, but imagine that I could take a brain, that's what this image on the left is someone actually took a brain and sort of peeled it open as if it was an orange, okay? You would see these fibers. What they'll do to help people with seizures is they cut the brain in half. Now, because the brain is plastic, elastic, and adaptable, these people live pretty normal lives. Their left hemisphere and their right hemisphere can adapt, can deal with the fact that they can no longer communicate with each other, right? It's like you have 2 brains in your skull. However, sometimes some interesting things happen with these split brain patients, and here's why. This is a little confusing. I'll post a video that will help explain it, okay? You may not be aware of this, but when you are looking out in the world, this is my left, the stuff that I see to the left, it actually goes to the right half of my brain. And the stuff that I see to the right, it goes to the left half of my brain. Now, for all of us with normal brains, with our corpus callosum, that's totally fine, because the stuff we see that goes to the left and the right hemispheres, these hemispheres can communicate with each other. No big deal. So every part of our brain knows about everything we see. In split brain patients who had seizures and had their brain cut in half, this is not the case, okay? The stuff in the left hemisphere, the stuff in their left visual field, only their right hemisphere knows about it. And the stuff in the right visual field, only their left hemisphere knows it. And remember how the left and right hemispheres do slightly different things? I told you all the left hemisphere is in charge of what? Logic and language, okay? So the left hemisphere, the part of the brain that is the talking, speaking, communicating part of the brain, for split brain patients, it only knows about things to the right. And the creative, artistic, the right half of the brain, it only knows about things to the left. Now, something else you know about the brain. Stuff you see to the right goes to the left. Well, the left hemisphere also controls the right half of the body, okay? So if you are trying to move your right hand, your left hemisphere is doing that. If you move your left arm, your left leg, your right hemisphere is doing that. So we had these interesting scenarios with split brain patients, okay? So what you have here is a split brain patient, okay? And the word face gets flashed to their right, okay? So it's to their right, so it goes to the left half of their brain, which is the language part. So if this patient is asked, what did you just see? Well, the part of the brain that's going to answer is the left hemisphere. What did the left hemisphere just see? The left hemisphere just saw the word face. So they will be able to say, I draw the word, or they'll be able to say, I saw the word face. Okay? Now, here's where things get weird. If you put the word face in their left visual field and then ask the person, hey, what did you just see? Well, which hemisphere is going to answer? The left hemisphere. And what did the left hemisphere see? Nothing. So this person will say, I saw nothing, because their left brain didn't see anything. Here's the crazy part. If you then tell that person who didn't see anything, if you say, draw with your left hand what you saw, they'll be like, I didn't see anything though. And I know, but draw with your left hand what you saw. Their left hand, which is controlled by the right half of the brain, sees things to the left. So they, after saying they didn't see anything, their left hand, almost like on its own, would draw like a smiley face. Because that's what the right brain saw. The left brain saw nothing, and he'll say, I didn't see anything. The right brain saw the word face, and therefore can make the left half of the body answer that question. It's like you have two brains inside your head. Isn't that wild? Isn't that creepy? I will post some of these videos, or we'll watch them in class. I want you to see an actual patient dealing with this, because it's confusing to the patients. I didn't see anything. Well, why did your left hand draw a face? I don't know. I didn't see anything. It's so weird. It's so spooky. So we'll watch one of these videos, or I'll post it for you. Some checks for understanding. I know this is a complicated concept. So just remember, stuff that you see to the left goes to the right. The right controls the left. Stuff that you see to the right, it goes to the left hemisphere, the language, and the left controls the right, okay? So some checks for understanding. Make sure you can answer these questions. We'll go over them in class. There's number 1 for you. I'm just gonna put them each up, and make sure you're looking carefully. The left is language, left controls the right. All right? And then right half of the brain controls the left half of the body. So you can pause these. Here is number 3. There's no such thing as alien hand syndrome. That's not something that we're talking about. Okay. Number 4. And number 5. Oh, this is an important question. This kind of question could be on an AP exam or on your test. Okay, so make sure you can do number 5 here. And then just a review from the beginning of class. What types of tests do these 5 things? Make sure you know about the scans. If you have questions or issues, send me an email. We'll watch some videos together in class, or I'll post those links for you so that you can really understand. I know my visual learners, those videos will be helpful for you, okay? Here are the video links. I'll make sure these be on the e-class, or we'll watch them together in class next week. Appreciate you all. Have a great weekend.